Imagine seeing a 7-year-old girl cry every single day on your bus. At first, you think it's nothing. Maybe she misses her mom. Maybe she's having trouble at school. But what if those tears were something else entirely? What if they were a desperate cry for help that no one understood? What would you do if one day, driven by concern and curiosity, you looked under her usual seat and discovered something that would shatter everything you thought you knew about this quiet little girl? Something so disturbing that it would expose a crime hiding in plain sight for months? This is the true story of Elizabeth, a second grader whose daily tears on bus Route 47 seemed ordinary to everyone around her. But to one observant driver named James, those tears would become the key to uncovering one of the most shocking cases of child abuse and evidence tampering his small town had ever seen. In the next 40 minutes, we'll uncover how a simple act of compassion led to the discovery of a horrifying secret that had been hidden just inches beneath where children sat every day. We'll explore how a community failed to see the signs, how one man's curiosity saved a life, and how something as small as a child's tears can be the loudest scream for help. You'll hear about the chilling discovery under seat number 12, the investigation that followed, and the dark family secret that nearly destroyed an innocent child. Most importantly, you'll learn why paying attention to the smallest details can mean the difference between life and death. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where children walked to school without fear, and where the most exciting news was usually about the high school football team's latest victory. Population 8,400, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, it was a place where front doors stayed unlocked and neighbors borrowed sugar without knocking. James Daniel had been driving bus Route 47 for 12 years. At 53, he was a fixture in the community, the kind of man parents trusted implicitly with their children. Every morning at 6:45 a.m. sharp, his yellow bus would rumble through the tree-lined streets, picking up the same kids from the same stops, following the same route that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. James prided himself on knowing every child who climbed those 3 black steps into his bus. He knew that little Robert always sat in seat 4 because it was closest to the window where he could wave at his dog. He knew that Samantha preferred the back seats where she could chat with her friends. He knew which kids needed gentle reminding about inside voices and which ones he could trust to help the younger ones with their seatbelts. But Elizabeth Thompson was different. She had started riding his bus at the beginning of the school year in September, a tiny 7-year-old with mousy brown hair that always looked like someone had tried to brush it but hadn't quite succeeded. She carried a worn pink backpack that seemed too big for her small frame, and she always sat in seat number 12, the one on the right side, 3 rows from the front. What struck James most about Elizabeth wasn't where she sat, but how she sat. While other children chattered and laughed, played games, or stared out the windows with wonder, Elizabeth would climb onto his bus each morning and immediately begin to cry. Not the loud, attention-seeking sobs of a child throwing a tantrum, but quiet, heart-wrenching tears that would roll down her pale cheeks as she clutched her backpack and stared straight ahead. At first, James assumed it was typical separation anxiety. Some kids took longer to adjust to school, to being away from home. He'd seen it countless times over the years. But as September turned to October, and October turned to November, Elizabeth's tears never stopped. Every single morning, every single afternoon, she would board his bus and cry silently until she reached her stop on Maple Street. The other children had begun to notice too. He'd catch them whispering, pointing, some giggling nervously at the strange girl who never spoke and always cried. A few of the older kids had tried talking to her, asking if she was okay, but Elizabeth would just shake her head and turn toward the window, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James had tried reaching out too. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" he'd ask when she climbed aboard each morning. But Elizabeth would only nod quickly and hurry to her seat, never making eye contact, never speaking above a whisper. What bothered James most wasn't just the crying. It was the way Elizabeth protected that backpack. She held it against her chest like a shield, her thin arms wrapped around it so tightly that her knuckles would turn white. Even when other kids accidentally bumped into her, or when the bus hit a pothole, she never let go of that pink bag. By December, James had started to worry. This wasn't normal childhood sadness. This wasn't homesickness or school anxiety. There was something deeper, something more troubling about Elizabeth's daily tears. The way she flinched when voices got too loud. The way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever adults were around. The way she always positioned herself so she could see both the front and back exits of the bus. Little did James know that what Elizabeth carried in that tightly clutched backpack, and what she had hidden beneath seat number 12, was far more than school supplies. It was evidence of a nightmare that had been unfolding behind closed doors for months, and those tears were the only way she knew how to call for help in a world where no one seemed to be listening. By the first week of December, James couldn't ignore what he was seeing anymore. Elizabeth's tears had become as predictable as the sunrise, but they were getting worse. What had started as quiet sniffling had evolved into something that made his chest tight with concern every time she stepped onto his bus. It wasn't just the frequency of the crying that worried him. It was the quality of it. These weren't the tears of a child who'd had a fight with a friend or forgotten homework. These were the tears of someone carrying a burden far too heavy for 7-year-old shoulders. James began paying closer attention to details he'd previously overlooked. He noticed that Elizabeth never ate lunch on the bus rides, even though the trip to school took nearly 30 minutes. He noticed that her clothes, while clean, always seemed too big or slightly wrong. A summer dress in December weather, tennis shoes with holes that let in the snow, a coat that hung off her tiny frame like it belonged to someone else. Most disturbing of all, he noticed the way Elizabeth reacted to certain triggers. If another child raised their voice, even in excitement, she would flinch visibly. If someone moved too quickly past her seat, she would pull that backpack even closer to her chest. And whenever the bus passed the stretch of road near her house, her crying would intensify, as if the closer she got to home, the more frightened she became. The other children had started to avoid her, not out of cruelty, but out of the uncomfortable feeling that comes from being around someone else's pain when you're too young to understand it. Seat number 11 and seat number 13 remained empty most days, creating a small island of isolation around Elizabeth and her tears. James found himself lying awake at night, wondering what to do. Should he call the school? Contact her parents? Or was he overreacting to normal childhood adjustment issues? He'd been driving school buses for over a decade, and he'd learned to trust his instincts about kids. But this felt different. This felt urgent. The breaking point came on a particularly cold Thursday morning in mid-December. Elizabeth had climbed onto the bus as usual, her tears already starting before she'd even reached her seat. But this time, as she settled into seat number 12, James heard something that made his blood run cold. "Please," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "Please help me." The words were barely audible, spoken to no one in particular, but James heard them clearly through the rearview mirror. Elizabeth wasn't just crying anymore. She was praying, begging someone, anyone, to notice that something was terribly wrong. That afternoon, as the children filed off the bus at their respective stops, James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of immediately driving away after Elizabeth's stop, he parked the bus and walked back to seat number 12. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but some instinct told him that the answers to Elizabeth's pain might be hiding in plain sight. As he approached her usual seat, James noticed something he'd never seen before. The seat cushion was slightly askew, as if it had been moved repeatedly. And there, just visible in the crack between the seat and the window, was the corner of what looked like a small piece of paper. His hands trembling slightly, James reached down to investigate. What he found wedged beneath that seat would haunt him for the rest of his life, and it would finally explain why a 7-year-old girl had been crying for help every single day, using the only method she knew to leave a trail of evidence that someone, somewhere, might eventually follow. Would you have looked? Would you have investigated that quiet plea for help, or would you have convinced yourself it was nothing? Because what James was about to discover would prove that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest secrets, and sometimes the most innocent places hide the darkest truths. James's heart pounded as he knelt beside seat number 12, his fingers trembling as they worked to extract the small piece of paper wedged in the crack. The bus was completely empty now, parked on a quiet side street where he'd stopped after Elizabeth's departure, and the only sound was the engine cooling and his own nervous breathing. The paper was folded multiple times, compressed into a tiny square no bigger than a postage stamp. As James carefully unfolded it, he realized it wasn't just one piece of paper. It was several, all folded together and hidden with the desperate care of someone who needed to keep secrets but also needed to preserve evidence. The first piece of paper made his stomach drop. In a child's careful handwriting, using what appeared to be a purple crayon, were the words, "He hurt me again last night. It hurts to sit down. I want to tell someone, but he said he would hurt Mama too if I tell." James's hands began to shake as he unfolded the second paper. This one contained more details, written in the same purple crayon. "He makes me do things I don't want to do. He says it's our special game, but I don't like it. I hid this under the bus seat because he checks my backpack every day." The third piece of paper was different, older, more crumpled, written in pencil. "Mama doesn't know. She works 2 jobs and sleeps when she gets home. He says if I tell anyone they will take me away and put me in a bad place with scary people. I don't want to go to a scary place, but I don't want him to keep hurting me." There were more papers, 7 in total, each one documenting a different incident, different pain, different pleas for help that had been carefully folded and hidden beneath the seat where Elizabeth spent 45 minutes every day traveling to and from school. The final piece of paper was the most recent, dated just 3 days earlier. "I see the bus driver watching me cry. I want to tell him, but I'm scared. Maybe if I keep putting these papers here, someone will find them and know that I need help." James felt sick. This innocent child had been using his bus as a safe deposit box for evidence of her own abuse, trusting that somehow someone would eventually discover her carefully hidden cries for help. And he had almost missed it. If he hadn't heard her whispered plea that morning, if he hadn't followed his instinct to investigate, these desperate messages might have remained hidden forever. But the papers weren't all that Elizabeth had hidden beneath seat number 12. As James carefully moved the seat cushion further, he discovered something that made him immediately reach for his phone to call 911. Hidden in a small plastic bag, wrapped carefully in tissues, was a piece of torn fabric that appeared to be stained with blood. Attached to it with a safety pin was another note. "This is from my nightgown. He tore it 2 weeks ago, and I saved it because someone on TV said evidence is important if bad things happen to you." A 7-year-old girl had been not only documenting her own abuse, but collecting physical evidence, all while maintaining the secret that was slowly killing her spirit. The sophistication of her evidence gathering was both heartbreaking and astounding. She had been essentially conducting her own investigation into the crimes being committed against her, leaving a trail that she desperately hoped someone would find. James sat in his empty bus, surrounded by the evidence of Elizabeth's suffering, and wept. How had an entire community missed this? How had teachers, neighbors, other parents failed to see that this child was in desperate need of rescue? How had her daily tears on his bus been dismissed as normal childhood sadness, when they were actually the only way she felt safe expressing her pain? As he carefully gathered the papers and prepared to call the authorities, James realized that Elizabeth's choice to hide her evidence on the school bus wasn't random. The bus represented the only space in her life where she had any control, any privacy, any hope of being noticed by someone who might help her. It was the one place she went every day where her abuser couldn't watch her every move or check her belongings. But this discovery was only the beginning. As James dialed 911 with shaking fingers, he had no idea that Elizabeth's carefully preserved evidence would lead investigators into a web of family secrets, community failures, and criminal behavior that would shock everyone who thought they knew the quiet little girl who cried every day on bus Route 47. The nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold. Detective Samantha Rodriguez had seen a lot of disturbing cases in her 15 years with the Pennsylvania State Police, But the call from bus driver James Daniel made her stomach turn in ways she wasn't prepared for. Within 30 minutes of James's 911 call, she was standing in an empty school bus, carefully photographing and cataloging Elizabeth's hidden evidence, while James recounted months of daily tears that suddenly made horrifying sense. "She's been trying to tell us for months," James kept repeating, his voice thick with guilt. "Every single day, she was begging for help, and we all just thought she was homesick." Detective Rodriguez had worked enough child abuse cases to know that children often found incredibly creative ways to document their trauma, but Elizabeth's systematic evidence collection was extraordinary for a 7-year-old. The progression of the notes showed an escalating pattern of abuse, and the fact that she had the presence of mind to preserve physical evidence suggested either remarkable intelligence or a desperate understanding that her situation was abnormal and criminal. The first priority was Elizabeth's immediate safety. Rodriguez contacted Child Protective Services and arranged for Elizabeth to be interviewed by a trained forensic specialist who could speak with her without further traumatizing her. But they had to be careful. According to Elizabeth's notes, her abuser had threatened to harm her mother if she spoke to anyone, and he had been monitoring her belongings closely. Dr. Nicole Patterson, a child psychologist specializing in abuse cases, was brought in to conduct the initial interview. The plan was to approach Elizabeth at school, in a safe environment where her abuser couldn't monitor or interfere. But when they arrived at Millbrook Elementary School the next morning, they discovered that Elizabeth hadn't attended classes in 3 days. Her stepfather called in sick for her, the school secretary explained. Said she had the flu and would be out for the rest of the week. Detective Rodriguez felt a chill run down her spine. Had Elizabeth's abuser somehow discovered her hidden evidence? Had he realized she was trying to get help? The timing was too coincidental to ignore. A welfare check at the Thompson residence on Maple Street revealed a house that looked normal from the outside. A modest 2-story home with a small front yard and neatly trimmed bushes. But when Andrew Thompson answered the door, Rodriguez immediately understood why Elizabeth had been so frightened. Andrew was Elizabeth's stepfather, a man in his mid-30s with the kind of controlled demeanor that set off alarm bells for anyone trained to recognize manipulation and potential violence. He was polite, cooperative, and had immediate explanations for everything. Elizabeth was sick upstairs. She'd been battling a stomach bug. The doctor said she needed rest and quiet. "She's a sensitive child," Andrew explained, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Always crying about something. My wife works 2 jobs, so it falls to me to handle most of the child care. Elizabeth just takes some getting used to, you know? She's had a hard time adjusting since her father died." But Rodriguez had read Elizabeth's notes. She knew that Andrew wasn't just a stepfather dealing with a difficult adjustment period. He was a predator who had been systematically abusing this child while her mother worked multiple jobs to support the family. When they asked to see Elizabeth, Andrew's demeanor shifted subtly. Still polite, still cooperative, but there was an edge now, a controlled tension that experienced investigators recognize as the moment when a suspect realizes the game might be up. "She's really not feeling well," he insisted. "Maybe tomorrow would be better? I'd hate for her to give you whatever bug she's fighting." It was Dr. Patterson who made the decision to push harder. "Mr. Thompson, we have some concerns about Elizabeth's well-being that go beyond a stomach flu. We need to see her today." The change in Andrew's expression was instantaneous and terrifying. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and Rodriguez saw something cold and dangerous flash across his features before he composed himself again. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Let me go get her." As Andrew disappeared upstairs, Rodriguez positioned herself near the front door while Dr. Patterson prepared for what might be a very difficult conversation. They could hear muffled voices from upstairs, Andrew's low and urgent, then what sounded like a child's frightened whimper. When Andrew returned with Elizabeth, the little girl looked exactly like someone who had been hiding a terrible secret for months. She was pale, thin, and moved with the careful, painful gait of someone whose body had been hurt. But most telling of all was the way she looked at Andrew. Not with the normal wariness a child might show a strict step-parent, but with the pure, animal fear of someone who knew exactly what this man was capable of. Elizabeth's eyes immediately found Detective Rodriguez, and in that moment, Rodriguez saw something that would stay with her forever. Hope. Desperate, fragile hope that maybe, finally, someone had found her carefully hidden messages and understood that she needed help. What happened next would determine whether Elizabeth's months of silent suffering and secret evidence gathering would finally lead to justice, or whether her abuser would find a way to silence her forever. The interview with Elizabeth took place in a specially designed room at the Children's Advocacy Center, a place created to feel safe and non-threatening for young victims. Dr. Patterson sat across from the 7-year-old girl, who clutched a stuffed animal and spoke in whispers so quiet they had to strain to hear her words. "Can you tell me about the papers you've been hiding on the bus?" Dr. Patterson asked gently. Elizabeth's response broke everyone's heart. Did someone finally find them? I was worried nobody would ever look. For the next 2 hours, Elizabeth told her story with the matter-of-fact tone that children often use when describing trauma that has become routine. The abuse had started shortly after her mother married Andrew 6 months earlier. It began with inappropriate touching, escalated to more serious sexual assault, and had continued regularly while her mother, Brittany, worked her evening shift at the hospital and her weekend job at a local restaurant. "Mama works really hard so we can have food and pay rent," Elizabeth explained, her thin fingers working nervously at the stuffed animal's fur. "Andrew said if I told her what he did, it would make her so sad that she might die like my real daddy did. He said people who get too sad sometimes die, and then I wouldn't have any parents at all." The manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. Andrew had used Elizabeth's grief over her biological father's death, her love for her mother, and her fear of abandonment to ensure her silence. He had convinced her that speaking up would destroy the only family she had left. But Elizabeth was smarter than Andrew had realized. While he controlled her home environment completely, monitoring her conversations and checking her belongings, he hadn't thought to search the school bus. Elizabeth had deliberately chosen seat number 12 because it was close enough to the front for the driver to see her, but far enough back that other children wouldn't easily notice what she was hiding. "I learned about evidence from a TV show," Elizabeth told Dr. Patterson. "The police lady on the show said that when bad things happen, you need to save evidence so the police can help you. I didn't know how to call the police without Andrew knowing, so I saved everything I could and hid it where maybe someone would find it." The physical evidence Elizabeth had preserved painted a horrifying picture of systematic abuse. In addition to the torn nightgown, she had saved tissues with blood, a bruised photograph of herself that she had taken with an old digital camera she'd found, and even recordings made on a small voice recorder that she had hidden in her room. "Andrew gave me the recorder for my birthday," she explained. "He said I could use it to practice reading out loud. But I used it to record when he hurt me, because on TV they said sound evidence was important too." The recordings were devastating. They captured not just the sounds of assault, but Andrew's threats, his promises that no one would believe her if she told, and his detailed descriptions of what would happen to her mother if Elizabeth ever revealed their special games. As investigators dug deeper into Andrew's background, they discovered that Elizabeth wasn't his first victim. He had been investigated twice before in other states for similar allegations, but charges had been dropped when the families suddenly moved away or the children mysteriously recanted their stories. Andrew had a pattern of targeting single mothers with young children, gaining their trust, isolating the families, and then systematically abusing the children while maintaining a facade of being a helpful, supportive stepfather. The investigation also revealed the extent of Andrew's psychological manipulation. He had been systematically isolating Elizabeth from any support system, convincing her mother that Elizabeth was going through a phase and acting out for attention. He had even convinced Brittany that Elizabeth's tears and behavioral changes were normal grief responses to losing her biological father. "He told me Elizabeth needed tough love, not coddling." Brittany sobbed when she was finally told the truth. "I trusted him to help her adjust. I thought I was doing the right thing by letting him handle the discipline while I worked to support us. How could I have been so blind?" But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. When police executed a search warrant on the Thompson home, they found Andrew's computer filled with images and videos that made it clear Elizabeth wasn't just being abused. She was being exploited as part of a larger network of predators who shared and traded evidence of child abuse. Elizabeth's carefully hidden evidence on Bus Route 47 had exposed not just her own abuse, but a criminal network that had been operating across multiple states for years. Her 7-year-old understanding of evidence collection had provided investigators with enough information to potentially rescue other children and bring down an entire ring of predators. But Andrew wasn't going to go down without a fight. As the investigation intensified and the evidence mounted against him, he began making plans that would put Elizabeth in even greater danger than before. Just when investigators thought they understood the full scope of Andrew's crimes, the case exploded into something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The computer forensics team, working on Andrew's seized electronics, made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Hidden in encrypted folders on Andrew's hard drive were not just images of Elizabeth's abuse, but a detailed log of what he called his collection. The files revealed that Andrew had been documenting and categorizing his abuse of Elizabeth with a methodical precision of someone running a business. Each assault was recorded, cataloged, and tagged with descriptive keywords that made the investigator's skin crawl. But the most horrifying revelation was still to come. Andrew hadn't just been abusing Elizabeth for his own gratification. He had been taking custom orders from other predators online, essentially running a made-to-order child abuse service where clients could request specific types of assault to be committed and recorded. This wasn't just abuse, Detective Rodriguez explained to the prosecutor. This was commercial sexual exploitation of a child. Andrew was essentially prostituting a 7-year-old girl to online predators, while her mother worked 2 jobs to support the family. The financial records seized from Andrew's accounts showed thousands of dollars in payments from various online sources, all connected to the sale and distribution of content featuring Elizabeth. What had appeared to be a stepfather helping to support a struggling family was actually a predator profiting from the systematic torture of a child. Elizabeth's evidence collection became even more remarkable in this context. Without understanding the full scope of what was happening to her, she had been documenting not just her own abuse, but evidence of a commercial child exploitation operation. Her hidden papers included dates and times that perfectly corresponded with Andrew's online activity logs, essentially providing investigators with a victim's eye view of a criminal enterprise. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal authorities became involved. The online network Andrew was part of included dozens of perpetrators across multiple states, all sharing, trading, and purchasing content featuring child victims. Elizabeth's case had opened a window into a world of organized child exploitation that most people couldn't even imagine existed. But as investigators worked to build their case, Andrew was making plans of his own. Intercepted phone calls revealed that he knew the investigation was closing in on him, and he was preparing to eliminate what he saw as the primary threat to his freedom, Elizabeth herself. "She's caused enough problems," Andrew was recorded saying to an unknown caller. "I should have handled this situation more permanently when it first started." The threat was clear enough that Elizabeth was immediately placed in protective custody, but Andrew had already disappeared. The helpful, charming stepfather who had fooled Elizabeth's mother and an entire community had vanished, leaving behind only a house full of evidence, and a child whose courageous evidence collection had exposed crimes that law enforcement was still working to fully understand. The manhunt for Andrew Thompson became a multi-state operation involving federal marshals, state police, and local authorities across the country. But Andrew had years of experience evading law enforcement, and he had resources that investigators were only beginning to discover. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was safe in protective custody, but the trauma of her experience was far from over. The little girl who had been brave enough to document her own abuse and hide evidence on a school bus was now facing the reality that her stepfather, the man who had terrorized her for months, was somewhere out there, free and dangerous, potentially looking for a way to silence her forever. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Andrew's crimes, but it had also put Elizabeth in greater danger than ever before. The evidence she had so carefully collected had saved her life and potentially saved the lives of other children, but it had also made her the primary witness in a case that could destroy an entire network of child predators. And Andrew Thompson would do anything to prevent that from happening. The manhunt for Andrew Thompson ended 3 weeks later in a dramatic confrontation at a truck stop outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Acting on a tip from a vigilant clerk who recognized Andrew from the widely circulated photos, federal marshals surrounded the stolen vehicle where Andrew had been sleeping. When they moved in for the arrest, they found more than just a fugitive. They found evidence that he had been planning to return to Pennsylvania to tie up loose ends, a euphemism that investigators understood to be a direct threat against Elizabeth's life. The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched child abuse cases in Pennsylvania's history. Elizabeth, now 8 years old and living safely with her maternal grandmother in another state, became the star witness in a prosecution that would ultimately bring down not just Andrew, but 14 other members of the online exploitation network he had been part of. Taking the witness stand was terrifying for Elizabeth, but Dr. Patterson had spent months preparing her for this moment. The little girl who had once cried silently on a school bus now spoke clearly and bravely about her experiences, her voice steady as she identified Andrew and described the abuse she had suffered. "I hid the papers on the bus because I knew someone would find them eventually," Elizabeth testified. "Mr. James was always nice to me, and I thought maybe if I left the evidence where he could see it, he would understand that I needed help." James Daniel, the bus driver whose curiosity had saved Elizabeth's life, was in the courtroom every day of the trial. He had struggled with guilt for months, wondering how he could have missed the signs for so long. But child psychologists and law enforcement officials assured him that his decision to investigate Elizabeth's hiding place had prevented what could have been an even greater tragedy. The evidence Elizabeth had collected, her handwritten notes, the physical evidence, even the recordings she had made, proved to be the foundation of the prosecution's case. Her systematic documentation had provided investigators with dates, times, and details that corroborated digital evidence found on Andrew's computers and in his communications with other predators. Andrew Thompson was ultimately sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The other members of the network received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, and the investigation led to the rescue of 7 other children who had been victims of similar exploitation. But the resolution of the criminal case was only the beginning of Elizabeth's healing journey. The trauma of months of abuse, combined with the stress of the trial and the upheaval of her entire life, had left deep scars that would take years to heal. Elizabeth is an incredibly resilient child, Dr. Patterson explained. Her ability to recognize that what was happening to her was wrong, to systematically document evidence, and to trust that someone would eventually help her. All of that shows a strength of character that will serve her well as she recovers. Elizabeth's mother, Brittany, also faced a long road to healing. The guilt of having unknowingly allowed a predator into their home, combined with the realization that her work schedule had provided Andrew with the perfect opportunity to abuse her daughter, nearly destroyed her. But with therapy and support, she was slowly rebuilding her relationship with Elizabeth and learning to forgive herself for the signs she had missed. The Millbrook community was forever changed by the case. Parents began paying closer attention to their children's behavior. Teachers received additional training on recognizing signs of abuse, and the school district implemented new programs designed to help children understand the difference between appropriate and inappropriate adult behavior. Bus driver James Daniel became something of a local hero, but he downplayed his role in Elizabeth's rescue. "All I did was pay attention to a child who was hurting," he said. "Any adult should have done the same thing." Elizabeth Thompson's story reminds us that sometimes the most important cries for help come not as screams, but as whispers. Sometimes they come not as words, but as tears. And sometimes they come not as direct pleas, but as carefully hidden messages left in places where we might never think to look. A 7-year-old girl's daily tears on a school bus seemed like nothing more than childhood sadness to everyone around her. But those tears were actually the visible sign of a desperate, systematic campaign to document evidence and seek help in the only way she knew how. Elizabeth's courage in collecting and preserving evidence of her own abuse, evidence that she hid beneath seat number 12 on bus Route 47, ultimately saved not just her own life, but the lives of other children trapped in similar situations. The case also highlights how predators operate in plain sight, gaining trust and manipulating entire families while committing horrific crimes behind closed doors. Andrew Thompson wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was a stepfather, a community member, someone who appeared helpful and trustworthy while systematically exploiting a vulnerable child. But perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth's story shows us the power of paying attention. James Daniel, the bus driver who finally noticed that those daily tears meant something more than homesickness, saved a child's life by following his instincts and investigating when something didn't feel right. Today, Elizabeth is a thriving teenager who has overcome incredible trauma to become an advocate for other abuse survivors. She speaks at conferences for law enforcement and child protection workers, sharing her story and explaining how children try to communicate when they're in danger. Her message is simple: pay attention to the quiet ones, notice the patterns that don't make sense, and trust your instincts when something seems wrong. Children find ways to ask for help, Elizabeth says now, but adults have to be willing to see the signs and act on them. The bus where Elizabeth hid her evidence has been retired, but seat number 12 has been preserved as part of a training exhibit used to teach investigators and social workers about the creative ways children try to document abuse and seek help. Elizabeth's hidden papers have helped train countless professionals to recognize signs they might otherwise miss. James Daniel still drives a school bus, still pays attention to every child who climbs those steps, and still trusts his instincts when something doesn't seem right. He carries Elizabeth's story with him as a reminder that the smallest actions, looking under a bus seat, investigating a child's tears, can mean the difference between life and death for a vulnerable child. What would you have done if you were the bus driver who saw a child crying every day? What would you have done if you heard that whispered plea for help? Would you have investigated, or would you have convinced yourself it was nothing? Elizabeth's story proves that sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary courage. A little girl's decision to document her abuse and hide the evidence on a school bus was an act of incredible bravery that exposed a criminal network and saved multiple children from continued exploitation. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about the quiet children around you who might be suffering in silence, share it. Talk about it. Help others understand that sometimes the smallest signs are the most important cries for help. And remember, if you ever suspect a child is being abused, don't hesitate to speak up. Your willingness to pay attention, to investigate, to trust your instincts could be exactly what a child needs to escape a nightmare and find safety. Elizabeth Thompson's tears on bus Route 47 were finally heard. Make sure you're listening for the next child who needs your help.